Here's a guy who thinks it's totally not special pleading to insist that everything needs a cause except for God.
Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to be answering the question, who created God? You see, many Christians assert the fact that God created everything. He created the land, the seas, the animals, the stars in the sky, and people with their souls and hearts. However, if everything we see had a beginning or a cause for its existence, shouldn't God also need a cause for his existence?
How do you know that everything had a beginning? Maybe the Big Bang was a beginning, but that's still debated. However, if the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, it was the beginning of time, because the universe is the space-time continuum. The universe exists whenever time exists.
I mean, doesn't this sound a little too convenient for Christians?
Yeah, it almost sounds like a special plea.
Look at this conversation, for example. Jimmy here says, God created everything. And Billy says, okay, cool, but who created God? And Jimmy's response, well, everything needs a cause for its existence, but not God, because he was always there.
What do you mean by always? Do you mean for all time? If that's what you mean, then the universe also always existed in that sense, even if it hasn't existed forever, because by definition, the universe exists whenever time exists. However, if time hasn't existed infinitely, then neither has God, because he can't exist for infinite time if there hasn't been infinite time. If by always you mean that God has existed for infinite time, then the universe too has existed for infinite time, because by definition, the universe encompasses all of time.
And that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. It seems as though some Christians shut off their minds and stop thinking about the origin of life because they automatically assume God was just always there. So in an effort to dive into this topic and provide an answer to both Christians and skeptics, we will be answering the question, who created God, through 3 points.
To say that God wasn't always there implies that there was a time when God didn't exist.
Point number 1. In order for people to exist, something needs to be eternal.
By eternal, do you mean that it has existed for infinite time? If you do, then there obviously has to be infinite time in order for something to have existed for infinite time. And if time has existed infinitely, then by definition, the universe has existed infinitely and therefore doesn't need a creator.
William Lane Craig in his book On Guard talks about Al-Ghazali's idea that you cannot go through an infinite number of events one at a time, and it implies that there needs to be a beginning.
Yeah, and William Lane Craig has ideas about how time works that are at odds with contemporary physics. The relativity of simultaneity shows that all moments in time are equally part of reality. It's a common misconception that any point in time needs to be reached before it comes into reality. This is not the case. The past, present, and future are all equally part of reality rather than being contingent upon the passage of all previous points in time. I made a video about how Craig ties himself in knots trying to make his view of time fit with contemporary physics and fails miserably. I'll put a link to that video in the description.
Now let me explain. Let's look at this pencil that the student is using. Now, it didn't just pop into existence. This pencil was bought by this student's mother before it was brought to school. But before that, this pencil was in a box being shipped to the store. And before that, the pencil was being manufactured in a factory. And before that, the materials to make pencils were being shipped in trucks. And before that, the materials were being gathered by the workers, and this goes on and on. The idea is that these events are like dominoes, and in the same way that one domino hits another domino and so on, these events cause the next event to happen until the pencil eventually gets to the student using it at school.
Yeah, but relativity shows that there are frames of reference in which these events are simultaneous rather than sequential. The argument you cited says that you can't have an infinite number of events one at a time, but events that are one at a time from one reference frame can be simultaneous from another reference frame. That's why no event needs to be reached in order to be part of reality. In a sense, every event that will ever happen is already part of reality. This is a bit of an abstruse concept, so here's MinutePhysics to explain it.
In our universe, when you change from a non-moving perspective to a moving one, or vice versa, that change of perspective is represented by what's called a Lorentz transformation, which is a kind of squeeze-stretch rotation of spacetime that I've mechanically implemented with this spacetime globe. A quick reminder, spacetime diagrams plot position on the horizontal axis and time on the vertical axis, so something that moves as time passes traces out a path through spacetime called a world line. One of the first things you might notice about Lorentz transformations is that events that were at different places at the same time before the transformation aren't at the same time after the transformation. This means that from the perspectives of people going different speeds, simultaneous events for one person won't be simultaneous for the other, and vice versa. For example, if from my perspective these two boxes spontaneously combust at the same time, and you're moving at a third the speed of light to my right, then from your perspective, that is, from the perspective in which you're not moving so your world line is purely vertical, from your perspective the box on the right will combust first, and the box on the left will combust second.
So events that are one at a time from one reference frame are simultaneous from another reference frame. Since there is no true reference frame, all events are potentially simultaneous, and thus all events equally occupy reality rather than needing to be reached in order to come into existence.
Now, instead of pencils, let's look at the Christian God of the Bible. Now, someone may ask, well, who created God? And for the sake of building an argument, let's just say that the Christian God and Jesus were created by a greater God. So let's call this God, God 2. So God 2 created Christian God. Nice, problem solved. But actually, another question arises. Who then created God 2? Well, actually, the answer's pretty easy. God 3 obviously created God 2. And this creates a bigger problem. Because if everything needs a cause for its existence, then us as people could never exist.
Again, this assumes that each point in time needs to be reached in order to be part of reality, which physics shows is not the case.
Why? Let's look at ourselves, the existence of people, as being a domino. And the Christian God who created us, he's the domino before us. And God 2 is the domino before Christian God, and God 3 is before God 2, and so on. Now, if everything always needed a cause for its existence, then there would be an unending or infinite number of dominoes. And if there was an infinite number of dominoes, we couldn't be here because nothing could ever begin.
I think Bertrand Russell had a good rebuttal to this, which was that an infinite regress is not really a problem because there's no logical problem with a series with no first term.
And for people who believe in the Big Bang Theory, this is still a problem. Because let's just say that the Big Bang does happen, the question still arises, how did it start?
The Big Bang started in the same way as a yardstick starts at its first inch. Newton discovered that objects in motion will stay in motion without anything needing to propel them. Only objects which were once at rest need something to get them going. The Big Bang is simply the earliest moment in the universe's expansion, which is still occurring today. If time also began at the Big Bang, then the universe itself has never been at rest, and thus never needed anything to get it to start moving.
How did the required materials needed for a Big Bang to happen get there?
If the Big Bang was the beginning of time, then they were never not there. There was never a time when the energy of the universe didn't exist, even if time doesn't stretch backward infinitely. If the Big Bang is not the beginning of time, then there's no reason to think that the energy involved hasn't been there forever.
And even if they did get there, how did those materials get there? No, the very fact that we are here and alive is proof that someone or something was eternal. Because if everything needed a cause for its existence, then there would be an infinite number of events that would need to happen in order for us to get here.
That's not true, but even if it were, why can't the universe itself be eternal?
And if there was an infinite number of events before us, things could never begin.
Again, that's not how time works.
Therefore, in order for us to be here, there needed to be a starting force to push down the first domino. Point number 2, the universe can't be eternal. Science tells us that our universe is actually expanding and that our universe has a limited amount of energy.
We don't actually know what the total amount of energy in the universe is. The law of conservation of energy just says that it doesn't increase or decrease. It is possible that the amount of energy is infinite.
Now, if our universe is expanding and we were to reverse time, our universe would just be a little bit smaller than it is today. And if we rewinded time over and over again, we would eventually be at a place where the universe started at a single point.
If that means that time itself also started at that point, then so did God. God can't exist for infinite time if there hasn't been infinite time. If time is not eternal, God can't be eternal. However, if time did not start at this single point singularity, then why couldn't the singularity have existed forever? You might ask why, after an infinite amount of time, the singularity suddenly started expanding, but an eternal God doesn't solve this problem. If God has been around for infinite time, why did he suddenly decide to start the universe?
In addition to that, think of the energy that's being used in the universe as a fuel tank to a car. If right now our fuel tank is half empty, then there needed to be a time in which the tank was actually full.
Yeah, the energy in the universe isn't going anywhere. I think this guy is thinking of entropy, the fact that the amount of usable energy in the universe decreases over time.
All of that to say, the fact that our universe is expanding right now and has a limited amount of energy that's being used in our solar system and galaxies, all of this points us to the fact that our universe had a beginning.
No, it doesn't. Even if it's the case that the universe hasn't been expanding forever and hasn't been running down the amount of usable energy forever, that doesn't mean that it hasn't existed forever. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been infinite time. And if there hasn't been infinite time, then God can't be eternal either, because being eternal means having existed for infinite time, which God can't do if there hasn't been infinite time.
And therefore could not be eternal.
That doesn't follow. Why couldn't the universe have existed eternally in the form of a singularity which doesn't use any of its energy?
Point number 3. The God of the Bible claims to be eternal. Psalm chapter 90, verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
If there is such a thing as everlasting to everlasting, that implies that time has existed infinitely. Since the universe is the space-time continuum, the universe, therefore, has existed for as long as time has existed. So if time has existed eternally, then by definition, the universe has existed eternally.
Notice how it says from everlasting to everlasting. What the author of this psalm is saying is that if you start from this infinite period of time here and travel to this infinite period of time over here, God was always there.
Then, by definition, so is the universe, because the universe is the space-time continuum. It is all of space and all of time. The universe, by definition, exists wherever space does and whenever time does.
He had no beginning and has no end. He always was, always is, and always will be. You see, for people who ask the question, who created God? They need to know that the God of the Bible is eternal in nature, which means that time doesn't apply to him.
Then what does it mean to say that he's existed for infinite time?
Because he is the God who created time.
If time has existed infinitely, why would it need to be created? How could you create something that has always existed? Even if time hasn't existed infinitely, there obviously could never have been a time when time did not already exist. And you can't create something at a time when it already exists, therefore time cannot have a creator.
And is therefore timeless.
How does that follow? Timeless would mean that he exists independent of time, which is the same as never existing.
And the Bible further explains that we as Christians are able to receive everlasting life in God because our God is eternal and capable of giving eternal life through Jesus.
But your life had a beginning. How can something be eternal if it has a beginning? I know you believe it won't have any end, but I thought eternal was supposed to mean having neither a beginning nor an end.
So to conclude, to answer the question, who created God, I would consider these 3 points. Point number 1, in order for people to exist, something needs to be eternal.
Not true, because no point in time needs to be reached in order to be part of reality, and even if the universe had a beginning, it doesn't need a cause.
Point number 2, the universe can't be eternal.
Then God can't be eternal because the universe encompasses all of time, so if God has existed for infinite time, by definition, so has the universe.
And point number 3, the God of the Bible claims to be eternal.
If God has existed for an infinite amount of time, then so has the universe, because by definition, the universe exists whenever time does.
For people who disagree, I would ask, what do you believe is eternal?
Maybe time is, and thus the universe, but maybe time began at the Big Bang, in which case nothing can be eternal, not even a god.
How do you think we came to be here on Earth?
We formed from chemicals, which formed from elementary particles, which formed from energy, which didn't need to be caused to exist because regardless of whether time had a beginning or not, it has never not existed. That energy did not need to be brought into existence because there was never a time when it wasn't already in existence.
And why do you believe that?
I believe that energy has never not existed because of the law of conservation of energy. I believe that time has never not existed because it would be a contradiction to say that time ever didn't exist, regardless of whether it had a beginning or not.
For me, I believe that God is eternal, and that he created people, and that he wrote down his words in the Bible so that we can know him.
If God has existed for infinite time, then there has to have been infinite time. Time would have to be as eternal as God. Since the universe, by definition, exists whenever time does, the universe would have to be eternal too, and thus would not need a creator. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.